Many thanks for coming. Welcome to the History of Science seminar series here at IAS. It's both an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Yulia Frumer. She is the, I'm going to mispronounce this, Bo-jung and Sun-young Kim Assistant Professor of East Asian Science at the Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining Hopkins, she received her master's degree from the Cohen Institute for the History of Science and Ideas at Tel Aviv University, and a PhD from the History of Science just down the road in the History Department program in the History of Science at Princeton. She subsequently spent a postdoc year at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Her first book just came out early 2018. I highly recommend it, Making Time, Astronomical Time Measurement in Tokugawa, Japan. And I have coupons in case you're interested, 20% off from the University of Chicago Press, came out University of Chicago Press. She's currently researching the development of Japanese humanoid robotics, focusing on how ideas of humanity or humanness affect technological design. She argues that it's essential to consider factors such as roboticists' non-engineering training, their engagement with science fiction and animation, their views on Buddhism and Western philosophy, and their perceived mission as educators among the forces that shape technological design. I also want to say before we start to thank the director, I always call you president, the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, Robert Dycraft, for providing funds for this seminar series, and I think it's been great turnouts this far because of our speakers. Now's a good time to turn off any cell phones, particularly if you have ringtones like I do, which is the Internationale en Français, and to welcome our speaker, many thanks for coming.
Robocon is Zazen. Robocon is robotics design competition, robotics contest, Robocon in Japanese. Zazen is a sitting meditation practice in Zen Buddhism. These two are not comparable. They're apples and oranges. It's absurd to put is in between. And yet this is precisely what Mori Masahiro told me when I talked to him 2 years ago. Now, Mori, he's famous for something that a lot of you probably know, this phenomena being the first person who formulated this phenomena of uncanny valley. That's a psychological phenomena in which there is a sudden change in the way we feel about technology, from increasingly feeling the sense of affinity as technology gets more and more human-like, to suddenly changing it and suddenly perceiving it as creepy when it becomes quite human, but not human yet. Now, this is something that people know quite, it's a very common knowledge, and it definitely is starting from 21st century when his article from 1970 was translated into English. What people don't know a lot is that he was also very influential in basically establishing the whole field of robotics in Japan. And these are just some of his technological inventions, and I will talk about them later in the talk. But beyond just building important devices and starting processes of innovation, he also just built the field. He had a lot of students that he placed in different labs, both in university labs in Japan and in corporate labs. And he wrote tons of books. And these books, some of them were peer-reviewed, professional engineering reviewed. A lot of them were more popular and a little bit of engineering self-help philosophy kind of style. But he was a very, very prolific writer who was talking about the different kind of interpretation of engineering practice and engineering thought. He was also the person who established the Robocon, the robotics competition. Back in the 80s. It started as a very, very small, tiny competition, but by now it's a global organization with different divisions, with people from different countries in different ages competing with robotic designs that they made. Now, I was asking him precisely about this. How did this whole thing with Robocon started? And that's when he says, Robocon is Zazen. And my jaw dropped, obviously, because why would you say such a thing? And he has an explanation. I will tell you his explanation later in the talk. But at this point, I will just take this as a kind of a starting point to talk about the role of Buddhism in his work. Now, when he started in a very, very ordinary engineering profession. In a post-war Japan, it's a recovery period. There is definitely a need for a lot of engineers, especially engineers that they were not involved in war efforts, so young people. And Mori gets the job in Tokyo University even before he finishes a graduate degree. And as he works there as a teacher and works on his PhD as well. And working there, he works on processes that are quite typical to engineers at the time. He works on process control research, feedback loops, and some chemical engineering when required. And some of you will also already recognize that a lot of these things are related to this new, emerging, amazing science of cybernetics that's happening in the US at the same time. A lot of times when we think about process control, we think about automation. Automation is something that is very important for industry in the 1960s. This is the farthest away thing from spirituality or anything that is related to mind that one could possibly think of. So industrial robots, this is not something that what you would think of related to any kind of spirituality. Automation, working on industrial robots. So one of the things that is required for designing industrial robots for Mori in late 50s, early 60s, he works on sequential logic. And it's really, really weird to explain what sequential logic in this room and this institution. So I know that it will sound silly to many of you, but for those who are not mathematicians, who are not part of computer science, a very, very kind of simple metaphor to explaining sequential logic is that if you had an algorithm and the algorithm meant to add 3 to something, to some kind of unknown value. So it's 3 plus x. It's not just, you don't mean to get x. It's 3 and something. But this x is also dependent on one step before that is also dependent on an additional unknown value, and et cetera, et cetera. And we get and we regress one step back with every calculation. And in each of these points, people make decisions as to what is important, what do users need, how do we want to design our robots, well, in case of algorithm, it's the kind of the functions that the algorithm perform, but Mori was designing circuits, and he was thinking in terms of sequential logic, as he needs, in order to understand how to design one particular part, he needs to understand the whole history of input. So he needs to know the history of human decision-making and human motivations, and as with the way that humans interacted with and thought about the users that eventually are going to be using the robots that he creates. And then he has this realization. He says, in order to increase automation, one needs to understand the agents that automated devices were designed to supplement or substitute their human users. And this is probably was a little bit a kind of a turning point for Mori. He reads cybernetics, so it's not that he's only coming to this alone. But not many people in Japan agree with that. Not many engineers in Japan at the time agree with the fact that in order to study automation, in order to produce automation, we need to study humans. And then Mori writes this article, an article about mistaken presuppositions about automation. And he says, it's a mistake to avoid studying elements that cannot be quantified. Most of the engineers that he dealt with in Japan at the time, they were saying that we studied something that could be put into numbers. And then he says, it's a mistake to ignore the role of environment in shaping users' choices. Finally, it's a mistake to think of machines as mere calculators. Machines are part of a complex system that binds together humans, technology, and society. And that's where the sense of cybernetics really, really comes together in this understanding of how technology is related to human society, to individual humans, and technology. And in order to explain how things are connected, Mori draws this diagram that is supposed to visually provide a manifestation of these connections between different components. And he really, really falls in love with these diagrams, and he starts drawing them in all of his different articles. And the interesting thing is that he sometimes refers to this as mandalas. And this actually looks a little bit different from most of Buddhist mandalas that I know, but he says these are mandalas. And mandala is a kind of geometrical structure that is used in Buddhism that is a meditative tool, that people are going from one geometric element to another in order to understand some kind of profound truth about the universe. And he says this is the same. He wants the readers of his academic articles to go through these different diagrams and to understand the connection between technology and society and individual humans. And then he goes further. He says, in order to devise better automation, it is necessary to provide machines with hands and fingers. Now, this is not just metaphorically hands and fingers. He speaks about hands and fingers. And he starts working with Kato Ichiro, who was then famous for a person who was the most important in designing prosthetics in Japan, in order to design literally hands and fingers. And not only hands and fingers, they try to design artificial lungs, artificial kidneys. I don't know, I don't think that these ever worked, but they worked on artificial kidneys and artificial arms and artificial fingers. Again, it's very important to understand the context, the historical context of this work. In post-war Japan, there were obviously a lot of people that were maimed, those who had their fingers, the limbs burned off during the raids. And by the mid-50s, there was a sense that the society needs to provide these victims with means to get back to normalcy. Now, there is a very complicated conversation to have about what this normalcy means in post-war Japan. But for those who design prosthetics, they look at this very, very straightforward. They say, we want to make fingers and hand that look like human fingers and hand. And we want to have some functionality and dexterity, and also to allow people to erase these symbols of war that everybody in Japan is trying to forget. While working on designing prosthetic fingers, Mori says, it's turns out to be so complicated. You try to design just one simple movement, and then you need to understand more. You need to understand how the whole hand moves, and you go to the arm, and then you go to the whole body. And then it turns out that in order to design just one movement for the finger, you need to understand the central control room of the human body, and that is the brain. So he needs to investigate how people think. And he has one additional reason. And that is, as he works on prosthetics, and he thinks that he designs better and better prosthetics with every time. They're more functional, they look more human, they're easier to use. And then suddenly his patients refuse wearing prosthetics. And he doesn't understand why. He thinks maybe there is something about functionality. No, maybe there is something about the fact that something is inconvenient. No, that's not the case. And then he realizes, he says, people are creeped out. The way that things look are really, really important. And he draws this, one of his diagrams that he likes so much, and he adds this element that is, I don't know if you can see, it says beauty and physical appearance. So when designing prosthetics, we don't only think about functionality, cost, material, all the things that engineers are taught to think about this. We need to think about beauty. And then, interestingly enough, that article came in 1968, and already in this article, next to this diagram, he draws a graph. And this is the graph that is familiar to everybody, the graph of Uncanny Valley, that he wrote before the famous 1970 article. And he first published this graph, first wrote this graph in relation to prosthetics, trying to explain why is it that his patients that he thought would like the new prosthetics that he designed, suddenly they're just not accepting this. And this is the English translation. Now, this work on prosthetics, work on pneumatic limbs, pneumatic arms, a lot of other different devices, that walking machines that he designs, that makes him pretty famous and important. So by 1969, he's 42. He's quite well known in the discipline among engineers, and he is lured away from Tokyo University to Tokyo Institute of Technology, or Tokyo Tech, as it's known. And Tokyo Tech is a very, very interesting institution in post-war Japan. And during the war, obviously, as any technological institution, they were involved with military effort. But immediately after the war, they take a turn, they become extremely Marxist, and they put a lot of liberal arts in their education, in the curriculum. They invite a lot of literary scholars, philosophers, and they establish a department in history and philosophy of science. That's one of the earliest in Japan. And they want their faculty to talk to each other. So it's not just paying some lip service to, okay, we're going to have liberal arts. They actually want collaboration. And that was a very, very fruitful environment for Mori to express his kind of philosophical ideas about Buddhism. And then immediately after he's hired, 1970 happens. 1970 was an amazing year. First of all, it was an amazing year for Japan. It was just 2 years after the Tokyo Olympics. And Tokyo Olympics were already kind of a sign that things are getting better for Japan. We're no longer in the recovery. We are now, we're important. The world sees us. We're in a global arena. Things are getting better. But then in 1970, just 2 years after, there was this Osaka Expo. Now, Osaka Expo, that was a big statement. A statement that Japan is really, now it's a major player, both in terms of economy, in terms of technology, and in terms of politics. For Mori, particularly individually, that was a huge year because of fame and achievements. One of the things that happens is that NHK, the Japanese broadcasting company, makes a special about him, about his inventions. It's 1970, okay? So this is his pneumatic hand, and this is something that is important in terms of his achievement. And as you can see, it doesn't have skin of fingers. It doesn't look humanoid. But in terms of dexterity, in terms of agility of the fingers and sensitivity of different parts, this is actually a masterpiece at this time. And this is the six-legged walking machine that Mori invented with one of his graduate students. And walking and definitely going up and down the stairs is one of the really difficult things in robotics. And even today, usually the test for robot, how well it functions, is making it go up and down the stairs. And you see there are wonderful videos, if you want to procrastinate, on YouTube of bloopers of robots falling off the stairs. Like they try to go up the stairs and they constantly fall. So this is a really important feat. This is Mori himself, and you see he's constantly smiling, and it's something that is interesting. He smiles all the time, and even now that he's 92, and he smiles, and even when I talk to him on the phone, I can hear him smiling. It's quite amazing. He's a quite positive person. So now it's going to go down. Yeah, a little bit, but it's fine. It's fine. So now there is this intro, and then narrator is going to start talking a little bit in Japanese. And what he's going to say, robots. These are the favorite things for children at every generation. All the children are in love with those. But then he says, no, it's not only for children. Serious scientists are now engaged in creating artificial humans. And Mori Masahiro, he's one of the serious scientists that he says that it's not only for children. This is what we're doing. We are creating artificial humans right now. Another important thing that happens to Mori in 1970 is that he's invited to publish in this journal of ESO, and that's the petroleum giant in Japan. And they have a journal, Energy. And they wanted to have a special issue, kind of a promotional issue. So they invited Mori Masahiro, his colleague Yoshida Natsuhiko, who was a philosopher of science at Tokudai, at the Tokyo Tech, and Komatsu Saikyo, who was probably the most important sci-fi writer in Japan in 20th century. And the whole issue is framed around conversation between the three of them. The beginning of issue is the conversation between three of them, and the end of it. And when they're starting the conversation, we start with a subtitle that reads, Nature equals human equal machine. And they start discussing what are the differences between humans, between machines, in what sense can we talk about differences. And there's a lot of philosophy, there's a lot of science fiction, but Mori participates this as a roboticist in telling about his own experiences of actually building artificial humans. In the middle, there are articles, and articles that they're also a combination of professional and latest science at the time, but it's framed in a more popular way. And in between these articles, there's Mori's own article, and that's the article that is titled Bukimi no Tani, or Uncanny Valley, that everybody knows, and that is translated today. And just as a side note, something that I wanted to mention, I use the term Bukimi no Tani. I use Uncanny Valley when I translate this into English because it's a conventional kind of translation. People know that, but it's not entirely right because uncanny is very much associated with Freud. And when the article was translated into English, we have a word, we have a tradition of psychology of talking about uncanny, and then the word bukimi was translated into uncanny. Mori did not know about Freud. He was not working in this tradition. So it is a little bit unfair to put him as if he was trying to build on something that existed in psychology before. He was talking about his own sense with working with prosthetics and working with pneumatic hands. Now, he develops a lot of notions about how this uncanny valley works, how the movement adds to the sense of creepiness. But he also mentions, he says, there are some things that are not creepy at all, and we need to think about them. What are the things that are not creepy? We need to understand why they're not creepy. And the example that he gives is this hand that is carved by an artist who usually works on carving statues of Buddhas. And he says, look at his hand, look at how marvelously it carved. It has all the nuances. We know that it's not human, and yet we feel a sense of affinity. We feel at ease with this hand. There is something very nice about this. And this mentioning of Buddhist hands is not accidental, because all this time, again in 1970, he meets an important person, a Zen priest, who becomes his kind of master for the rest of his life. Well, for the rest of priest life, actually. Mori goes and consults with him. He asks him about things about nature of Buddhism, about Buddhist practice. And it's important to notice that this priest was from Rinzai Zen. And Rinzai Zen is a little bit different. Unlike other kind of Zen, it doesn't only focus on meditation practice, but it has all kind of devices that are meant to snap people out of regular thinking. So something that will make people to achieve nirvana, but like in a very, very sudden way, and is something quite a violent way. And most of you probably know koans. Koans is one of the devices that they employ that is a kind of riddle that is absurd. And by trying to understand how exactly this works, then people are trying to suddenly see the reality a little bit different. As an example, there is a very, very famous story about this Zen master who takes a fan out, holds a fan, and asks his students, he says, what is this? One of them says, it's a fan, and he gets smacked on the head. As Rinzai is sometimes quite violent, so that's what they do. The second one takes the fan, opens it, and starts fanning himself. And the master said, okay, that's better, but still not the best. The third one takes the fan, opens it, places a cookie on the fan, and serves it to the master. And the master said, oh, yes, that you understand things. So the message is that people should not be confined by words or even by functions of what the devices are supposed to be. Rather, they're supposed to perceive the materiality of what they have and act in accordance to the opportunities that this materiality provides. And Mori liked this a lot. And he liked it so much that he thought that he would use this in engineering. He wants to use it in engineering. And he established what in English is called the Mukta Institute. In Japanese is Jiyu Jisai Kenkyujo. Kenkyujo is a lab. And Jiyu Jisai, it's a Buddhist term, something like freedom, but obviously it's not an American freedom. It's not the freedom to carry arms or anything like that. It's a freedom from presuppositions, freedom from having very strict assumptions about how world is supposed to work. So the members of this institute, a lot of engineers from different places, not only from Mori's lab, but also from other labs and other universities and from corporations. One of the main people, one of the main clients of this institute is Honda, that they're sending a lot of engineers to go there to practice Zazen together, to talk about, to recite sutras, to talk about Buddhism, and to try to become better engineers. So they try to boost their creativity, their engineering creativity, by practicing Buddhism. Now, there are things that are happening in the world of why it is really, really important for them to do that. In 1970, as I mentioned, Japan is by now a major technological player in the world, but there is still a lot of kind of condescending comments that actually they're even today you can hear about Japanese just copying everything. They're not producing anything new. There is nothing really innovative about Japan. So Japanese engineers feel that they need to prove themselves. They need to establish something that there's their own, that they can take credit for it. And a little bit, couple of years later, Mori writes about this, and he says, what are the things that are lacking in engineering in Japan still that he wants to see? And he says, there are national styles of technology. Americans have a pioneering spirit, and I really like this quote. Americans are like bulldozers. They use a lot of energy with huge machines. But Europeans are different. They use small technical, they focus on small technical parts that use little energy but are very intricate. And now he says, I want Japanese engineers to have their own style. And in 1970, everybody knows about Japanese design, it's about Japanese arts, and a lot of people admire Zen art, tea houses, gardens, but Mori says, no, technology is different. We cannot treat this in the same way. Technology needs to be distinguished in its precision, efficiency, and strength. He says, when I want to go to an international conference, look at the machine and recognize that it's Japanese. And he thinks that by cultivating this Zen practice, this creativity that derives from Zen practice, that is the way in which he can create this national style of engineering that could be recognizable. And there are several key words that he likes to use that are important to him, but also repeated by other engineers at the time. One of them is the term Yawarakai, which is both soft and flexible in Japanese. And he talks in different meanings. First of all, he wants machines to be flexible, being soft, being made from soft materials, like the pneumatic hand that has a lot of flexible and soft parts. He wants machines to be flexible in the sense that they allow more development. So whenever you design something, it's not a final product. It allows places that could be developed even further. And finally, he wants people to have flexible minds. He says engineers needs to have flexible mind, like this person in this koan. He also propagates unseriousness. He says all these studies, the people doing, they're too serious. And being too serious prevents them from being creative. So we need to be unserious. And he a little bit plays on the history in Japanese history. There was a famous modernizer of Japan in the 19th century, Fukuzawa Yukichi, who wrote these books in praise of learning. So Mori kind of laughs at him, and he writes books in praise of unseriousness. And finally, he also plays on different words between to make something move, or to revive something, or to make the best of it, to say how engineers, by making machines move, they also become more human. They revive themselves, they revive their minds. And he straightforwardly writes books about Buddhism. And his first book about Buddhism was just Introduction to Buddhism. And it was in 74, and then it was translated, I think, first in Dutch and then in English. And he continues to write about Buddhism. Now, some of you may notice that this kind of Buddhism that he practices is A, very, very corporate, and B, quite outward looking. So it's something but the thinking of how the world will be perceiving them, quite Americanized, frankly. And that is true. I think that all these criticisms are absolutely correct. But I'm not here to try to judge whether his Buddhism was the real Buddhism or not real Buddhism. For me, the important thing is to see how what he thinks that he's doing in Buddhism, how it influences the way that he designs things and how he teaches his students. So one of the things that he says is Buddhist-inspired is to be open to a variety of influences, of getting inspiration from different kind of things that we see in the world. And a lot of them are animals. And he says, it's not like I want to recreate an animal, but I want the image of a living being to be a trigger to a mind, to be inspired, and to see it how fish goes, or birds, or animals move, and to try to create machines that they employ the same devices that living organisms employ. And this is what he does. So this is a robot that he designed, well, he presented this in 1975, congregating, flocking robots. So a bunch of those are released in a field, and then they're able to move independently of each other, but when they get one near each other, they don't bump into each other, they're able to sense each other, and then eventually they start moving in unison, they're flocking. So this is quite interesting. I think that there are still a lot of engineers who work on exactly the same problems, even now. Like periodically I see news about congregating robots. And he's doing this in 75, and he won a big prize for this. But what does this has to do with Buddhism? First of all, the person that he designed this with, Matsubara Sueo, was the chairman of the Mukta Institute, this Buddhist lab that he's talking about. Second, it's three-eyed. So this is the iconography of Buddhism, of the third eye, of seeing something that is very, very prominent. He didn't have to design it. It was important for him to have this third eye. It's animal-based. In Japanese, he called these machines, he counts them by a counter that is used for small animals, hiki or piki. He refers to them as small animals. It's obviously exhibiting social behavior. It's part of a society. It's unserious. And that is a little bit of part of this whole video where Mori starts and he calls them Triops congregans Masahiro, which is as if it's a new kind of species that he invented. And he's now presenting it to the world. It's like an evolutionary process. And he laughs at this because obviously it's a joke, but it's a part of his serious presentation. It's flexible, and they're moving and they're as if they're alive. Now, Mori is working on this, and he teaches Buddhism. But as many professors know, all of us who need to teach undergraduates, he faces one problem. And the problem is that his undergrads are bored. And it's quite difficult for somebody who needs to teach about sequential logic, and it's not the most lively topic for especially on the undergraduate level. And he's bothered by this because he wants to inspire students, but his students are falling asleep. So what to do? So he designs a competition in one of his classes in which he says there's going to be a contest by the end of the class. Throughout the semester, he divides the class into different teams, and he gives them all the same assignment, the same prompt. Create a vehicle that travels the farthest using only 2 batteries as a source of energy while carrying at least 1 adult human being. So that was in the fall of 81, and in February 82, all of them, the whole class and a lot of people on the campus, gathered together in order to see the competition. Now, there were 2 teams that they were capable of moving the vehicle maybe a couple of inches, not more than that. 2 batteries is not that much. There was one team that kind of cheated because the vehicle moved about an inch, but then there was an inclined plane and it kind of slid down. And Mori said, like, no, that's cheating. That this is not what you're supposed to do. But there was one way of doing this. Not this. This is just a graphic. this is not a design. He really liked cameras, so he videotaped a lot of things, and this is he videotaped the competition. So this is the team. They're getting one of their teammates or assistants to satisfy this requirement of carrying a weight of one person, and then they start and. They start, and not much happens. They just things don't. The vehicle doesn't move. Nothing happens there. It's cold, but and I'm gonna just move a little bit forward because really nothing happens for a really long time. Not much happens, right? But they see that something is moving. Like obviously it makes noise, and something is moving. Like machine is working. It does something, but it obviously doesn't move forward or anything like this. And now all the people around they start wondering. They're saying like, "What is going on?" People are kind of laughing and like, "What the hell?" And a lot of people don't understand what is it. There are a lot of kind of wondering faces, skeptical. But one thing is clear, that this guy is much higher. So his seat is much higher than it used to be. So the machine is what it's doing now is getting him much higher above the ground. And now they're almost running out of time because it's all timed. If they're not moving and in just a few seconds, they're going to lose. So by now, they're already moving much further than the other vehicles. And not only that, is that this vehicle now starts speeding up and moving faster and faster and faster. And they kind of need to run after it, like, and it's going across the campus. So what does this all has to do with Buddhism, right? It turns out that Mori gave them a kind of koan, that they needed to change their thinking in order to find the solution to this problem. And the kind of change that they needed to perceive is that the requirement to carry the weight of one person, it wasn't a restriction, it wasn't just a criteria test, it was a hint of a possible solution. And this team, they used the battery power in order to elevate the guy, to put him a little bit higher, and then they released, and then the pressure of the one full individual created more energy. So they kind of like jump-started a weak battery, in a sense, by using the weight of this person who sat there. And that is a kind of solution that Mori says, this is the way that you need to change your mind and be creative and just see what are the possibilities that you have in the materials that are provided. Now, this drew a lot of attention. Again, NHK loves him because he's such a wonderful guy to present and all his inventions. And NHK starts making a program about this, and they start expanding it, not just at Tokudai, but other universities, high schools now, and then it gradually grows into international, big international competition. And it becomes a real thing when Mori retired, and at the time people in Japan retired at the age of 63, the most important thing for him was to continue to propagate Robocon as well as maintain the Society for Japanese Robotics. So how he explains his involvement with Robocon, what is the meaning of Robocon is Zazen? He says, Robocon achieves the same result as Zazen. Zazen makes you feel really good, forget yourself, become completely absorbed in your practice. And during Robocon, students who build robots are completely absorbed in constructing robots. When it happens, they become more human-like, their eyes shining. And that is the interesting that he really keeps repeating it, that when there is the creative mode of designing comes, then students become more human-like. They're more human than other humans that they're not in this mode of kind of meditative state. And again, he explains this with his favorite mandala-like diagram where Robocon is in the middle and human and thing and education are on different sides, and the question of inspiration and mindfulness, etc. Now, Mori, beyond establishing the Robocon and building these things, about formulating the uncanny valley phenomena, he's very important just for sheer number of students that he educated that are now leading labs in Japan. One of the very famous students of his, Hirose Shigeo, and he's famous for designing a robotic snake. And he started this from, in 1980s, Mori was observing snake movements and filming snake movements in order to investigate this and in order to design robots, biomimetic robots, that are moving like real life animals and then capable of getting into places so that maybe other things cannot get into. So this is one side, one kind of students that Mori educated, those who went into biomimetics direction. There are other ones that some of them direct students, some of them are indirect students, who now turn into humanoids, and they say, we understand the phenomena of uncanny valley. We want to solve it. We don't want it just to let it be there. We want to understand what exactly causes the feeling of creepiness, and we want to create robots that will not cause that. One of the people, important people, Asada Minoru in Osaka, who works on raising robots. So he says humans will learn by experiencing different things and having encounters. So in order for robot to be similar to humans, it's not enough to have an appearance. We need to raise him cognitively. And this is something that roboticists in Japan, as in MIT, for example, is also in the 90s, they experienced this cognitive turn. And Ishiguro Hiroshi, that you can see here, he says, we need now to create an android science that combines engineering with psychology and anthropology and sociology to create something that where we can understand humans and humanoids one in relationship to each other. And he's famous for building these clones. So one of these is a clone of himself and one of him is real. Yes, I know that. Believe me, actually, he looks like an alien himself. So if we're talking about uncanny valley, I'm not sure like if the real human being is much different from this. But he makes a lot of his clones, and just last week, just precisely for this lecture, I guess, he released this android that was unveiled in Kyoto Temple, and that is a robotic Bodhisattva Cannon. So, Bodhisattva Cannon is a bodhisattva that sees the voices. It's a bodhisattva of mercy that is supposed to see and hear the suffering of all the beings, and it's capable of saving humans or any beings from suffering. And now we have a android bodhisattva in a temple. That it's a gimmick. I know it's a gimmick. It's obviously it's a gimmick. But there is this tradition in which we think of Japanese roboticists thinking of androids, of this kind of humanoid robots that not only that they allow us humans to understand our own humanity by means of Buddhism, but also to bring to maybe even higher state as something as Bodhisattva. So why all this matters? When Mori was asked why all this matters back in the 70s, this is what he said. He said, a lot of people think that science and religion are completely opposed. That they say, well, why are you investing this? This is a waste of time. Now, that was back in the 70s, and definitely since then, we no longer believe in that, and we talk about the importance of religion in the lives of many scientists. But there is still, it's much easier for us to talk about religion in the lives of scientists and work of scientists in, let's say, early modern period and Kepler. We can still talk about this in 19th century or early 20th century, but the more we get to our present day, the more difficult it is for us to talk about the role of religion and engineering or a science that people produce, how it actually affects the final product. And historians of science do that, and definitely in the past couple of years, several of them are doing a fantastic job highlighting how religious belief affects the final product. And here is another example of not just modern science, but a future science, as something that leads us into 21st century, a futuristic technology that is heavily influenced in its origin and its motivation by Buddhist thought of Mori Masahiro. Yeah. Thank you.